March 1945. 50 terrified German female prisoners were locked in a barracks with male American soldiers for the night. They braced themselves for the horrors their propaganda had promised, clutching whatever they could use as weapons. But when morning came, nothing had happened. The soldiers had simply slept in their cots and left them completely alone. What did these women discover about America in captivity that shattered everything they'd been taught to believe about strength, weakness, and which side were really the monsters? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In March of 1945, the world that German women had known for 12 years was crumbling like ash in their hands. The Nazi government that had promised them 1,000 years of greatness was collapsing after only 12. Every day brought news of another city fallen, another army destroyed, another miracle weapon that failed to appear. The radio broadcasts that once boomed with confidence now crackled with desperate appeals for final resistance. Women who had spent their youth in the League of German Girls, learning to march in formation and believe without question, now found themselves drafted into military service as the men ran out.
The economic reality was brutal and simple. A loaf of bread in Berlin, if you could find one, cost more than a week's wages. The ration cards that every German carried promised food that did not exist. Families boiled potato peels to make soup. Children forgot what chocolate tasted like. The stores stood empty, their shelves bare except for dust and the occasional jar of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. The infrastructure that had once made Germany proud lay in ruins. Trains rarely ran on time anymore because the tracks were cratered by bombs. Factories that once hummed with production now stood silent, their windows blown out, their machines cold. Power came and went. Water had to be carried in buckets from public pumps because the pipes were broken. Into this dying world, the Nazi propaganda machine continued to pump its poison. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every poster on every remaining wall carried the same message about the Americans. They were portrayed as a mongrel nation, racially impure and morally degenerate. The propaganda said American soldiers were criminals released from prisons to fight. It said they were controlled by Jews who wanted to destroy the German race. Most terrifying of all for German women, the propaganda painted horrific pictures of what American soldiers would do to captured German women. The posters showed bestial caricatures with grasping hands. The radio programs described atrocities in graphic detail. Every German woman in uniform had heard these stories repeated until they seemed like established facts, rather than calculated lies designed to make Germans fight to the death rather than surrender.
Marguerite was 24 years old that March, though she felt ancient. She had grown up in Hamburg, the daughter of a shopkeeper and a schoolteacher. Her childhood had been comfortable and ordinary until 1933, when everything changed. At age 12, she joined the League of German Girls because everyone did. She learned to march. She learned the songs. She learned that Germany had been betrayed after the First War and that the Führer would restore national greatness. She learned that some people were valuable and others were not. She accepted these lessons the way children accept multiplication tables, as simple facts about how the world worked. At 18, she had planned to study nursing at the university in Hamburg. Then the war came. At first, it seemed glorious and distant. Poland fell in weeks, France fell in months. The newsreels showed triumphant soldiers and cheering crowds. But then, the war stopped moving forward and started grinding. Her brother died at Stalingrad. Her cousin died in North Africa. The boy she had planned to marry died when his U-boat never returned. The bombing of Hamburg in 1943 killed 40,000 people in a single night. Her family's shop burned. The nursing school closed. In 1944, as Germany ran short of men, they began drafting women into military auxiliary roles. Marguerite joined the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Women's Signal Corps. They were not supposed to be combat soldiers, but they wore uniforms and lived on military bases and worked the communications equipment that kept the shrinking German armies connected. She learned Morse code and radio procedures. She filed reports and transcribed messages. She did not ask what the messages contained or where the orders led. Asking questions had become dangerous.
By March 1945, Marguerite's unit was stationed near the Rhine River, trying to maintain communications as the American and British armies closed in from the west. The German soldiers they worked with were increasingly young boys and old men, equipped with obsolete weapons and sustained only by terror of what would happen if they retreated. The officers spoke constantly of new weapons coming soon, of armies gathering for counterattack, a final victory just ahead. But the sounds of American artillery grew closer every day, and the refugee columns streaming east grew longer. When the Americans broke through on March 15th, everything dissolved into chaos. Officers fled in commandeered vehicles. Soldiers threw away their weapons and tried to blend into the civilian refugees. Marguerite and 57 other women from her unit found themselves cut off, surrounded, with nowhere to run. They burned their papers and waited in a farmhouse cellar. When the American soldiers arrived, the women held each other and prayed and prepared themselves for what the propaganda had promised would come.
But the American soldiers who came down into that cellar looked nothing like the propaganda posters. They were young men, most of them, tired and dirty from fighting. They carried rifles but pointed them at the floor. One of them spoke some German and told the women to come outside with their hands visible. The soldiers searched them for weapons, efficiently and impersonally, then gave them water from canteens and sat them in a field to wait. No one was hurt. No one was threatened. The women sat in confused silence, waiting for the horror to begin. They were loaded onto trucks and driven west, away from the fighting. Marguerite watched the German countryside pass, noting the bomb craters and destroyed bridges, the burnt-out tanks and the crosses marking graves. She also noted something else. The American trucks ran smoothly. The American soldiers had clean uniforms and good boots. They ate from ration packages that seemed to contain actual food. One soldier near her opened something called a Hershey bar and ate chocolate as casually as if it were bread. Chocolate. Real chocolate. Marguerite had not seen chocolate in 2 years. After 6 hours, the trucks arrived at a temporary holding facility that the Americans had set up in what had been a French factory. The building still stood mostly intact, and the Americans had converted it into a processing center for prisoners. The women were lined up, counted, and registered. A female American military clerk, speaking through an interpreter, explained that they would be held until their cases were reviewed. They would receive food and medical care. They would not be mistreated if they followed instructions. The women listened with the stunned silence of people who expect to be lied to. Then came the evening, and with it the moment that Marguerite would remember for the rest of her life. The women were led into a large room that had once been a factory floor. Rows of canvas cots had been set up with thin mattresses and blankets. The women assumed this would be their sleeping area and began choosing cots, grateful to have beds at all. Then American soldiers began carrying in more cots and setting them up in the same room. Male soldiers, setting up their own beds right beside the women's area. No wall between them. No separation at all. The fear that gripped the women was absolute and primal. This was it. This was what they had been warned about. They were being kept in the same room as the men so that in the darkness the attacks would come. Some women began to cry quietly. Others looked around desperately for weapons or escape routes. Marguerite picked up her small suitcase and held it in her lap, planning to use it as a shield. She looked at the nearest American soldier, trying to read his intentions and his face. He was perhaps 20 years old, with red hair and freckles. He looked exhausted. He caught her staring and gave a small, awkward smile, then looked away.
The lights were turned down. The soldiers lay down on their cots, and then, impossibly, they went to sleep. Just went to sleep. No threats, no violence, no leering or crude comments. Within 20 minutes, the room filled with the sounds of men snoring. The women sat frozen on their cots, not understanding, waiting for the trap to spring. But nothing happened. The night passed. Morning came. The soldiers woke, dressed, and left for breakfast duty. They had simply needed somewhere to sleep, and they had slept, and that was all. The women looked at each other in the gray dawn light, and in their eyes was the first crack in everything they had been taught to believe. If the propaganda had been wrong about this, what else had been a lie? The morning after that first impossible night, a whistle blew at 6 o'clock. The American soldiers rose from their cots, stretched, and filed out of the room without looking back at the women. Marguerite and the others sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to understand what had not happened. Then a different soldier appeared at the door, a woman this time, wearing an American uniform with a red cross on her arm. She spoke German with an accent and told them to come to the dining area for breakfast. The women followed, still cautious, still waiting for the cruelty to begin. The dining area had been set up in another section of the factory building. Long tables with benches stretched across the floor. The American soldiers were already eating, sitting in groups and talking loudly the way young men do everywhere. They barely glanced at the German women as they entered. At the far end of the room stood a serving line where several American cooks in white aprons stood behind steel containers that steamed in the cool morning air. The smell hit Marguerite first. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter brown water made from acorns that Germans had been drinking for years, but actual coffee with a rich smell that made her stomach ache with sudden hunger.
The women were directed to take metal trays and move through the serving line. The first cook put 2 pieces of white bread on each tray. White bread! Marguerite stared at it. She had not seen white bread since before the war. In Germany, even the bread ration was made from sawdust and potato flour now. Dark and heavy and never enough. This bread was soft and pale, and there were 2 whole pieces of it. The next cook added a pat of yellow butter, real butter, not the gray margarine that tasted like soap. Then came a spoonful of red jam that gleamed like jewels. The next server put a tin cup of coffee on the tray, and the one after that added 2 strips of crispy bacon. Marguerite carried her tray to a table where several other women from her unit had gathered. They sat down and stared at the food. No one wanted to eat first. It seemed impossible that this was real, that they would be allowed to eat it, that it was not some trick or test. Finally, one of the younger women, a girl named Helga, who was only 19, picked up the bread and took a small bite. When nothing bad happened, the others began to eat. The butter melted on Marguerite's tongue. The jam was sweet enough to make her eyes water. The coffee was hot and strong and tasted like something from a dream of better times. She ate slowly, making it last, and watched the American soldiers eating the same food without any sense that it was special or rare. For them, this was normal. This was just breakfast.
After the meal, the women were taken to a medical examination area. This was what Margarita had been dreading. Medical examination was a phrase that could mean many terrible things. But when they arrived, there were 3 American women waiting for them. One was a doctor, one was a nurse, and one was an interpreter. The doctor was older, perhaps 50, with gray hair pulled back and kind eyes behind glasses. Through the interpreter, she explained that she needed to check everyone for injuries, infections, and contagious diseases. Each woman would be examined privately behind a curtain. The examinations were quick and professional and respectful. The doctor asked permission before touching anyone. She apologized when the stethoscope was cold. She gave each woman a small paper packet containing aspirin and told them through the interpreter that they could ask for more if they had headaches or pain. When Margarita came out from behind the curtain after her examination, she felt confused by the gentleness of it all. The nurse gave her a bar of soap, a toothbrush, and a small tube of toothpaste. These were gifts, the interpreter explained, not loans. They were hers to keep. Marguerite held the soap to her nose and smelled the clean, fresh scent of it. In Germany, soap was made from clay and sand now, harsh and gray and rationed to 1 bar per month for an entire family. This soap was white and smooth and smelled like flowers. She put it carefully in her pocket like the treasure it was.
The days began to fall into a routine. Wake at 6, breakfast at 6:30. Then the women were assigned to light work duties, mostly cleaning and organizing. Nothing difficult or dangerous. The American soldiers they encountered during these duties were bizarrely casual and friendly. They said good morning in broken German. They offered cigarettes, which most of the women refused at first because they suspected the cigarettes might be drugged or poisoned. But eventually, curiosity won, and they tried the American cigarettes and found them smooth and mild, so different from the harsh tobacco that German soldiers smoked. One morning, about a week after their arrival, a large truck pulled up outside the facility. The women watched through the windows as soldiers began unloading wooden crates. The crates were marked with words in English that none of them could read. The soldiers carried the crates into the kitchen area, and later that day at lunch, something appeared on the serving line that none of the German women had ever seen before. It was served in small paper cups with wooden spoons. It was white and cold, and when Marguerite tasted it, the sweetness and cold burst across her tongue like a miracle. She had no idea what it was.
The interpreter, seeing their confusion, laughed and told them it was called ice cream. It was frozen cream with sugar and vanilla. Americans ate it all the time, she said, especially in summer. The German women ate their ice cream slowly, reverently, trying to understand how a nation could have so much of everything that they could freeze cream and sugar just to make a cold dessert for ordinary soldiers and prisoners. In Germany, cream had vanished years ago. Sugar was a memory, and these Americans were giving ice cream to enemy prisoners as if it were nothing special at all. That afternoon, Margarita was assigned to help carry supplies to the kitchen, and she saw inside the American food storage area for the first time. The sight stopped her in her tracks. There were shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with cans and boxes and bags. She saw canned meat hanging in cold storage rooms, hundreds of pounds of it, more meat than her entire neighborhood in Hamburg had seen in a year. She saw sacks of white flour stacked 6 feet high. She saw crates of canned vegetables with colorful labels showing peas and corn and tomatoes. She saw boxes of chocolate bars, cartons of cigarettes, jars of peanut butter, tins of coffee, bags of sugar. The abundance was obscene. It was impossible. It made no sense.
A young American soldier noticed her staring and tried to explain in his limited German. This was normal, he said. This was standard supply for a unit this size. Back home in America, he said, the stores had even more. His mother could buy anything she wanted. Margarita wanted to tell him he was lying, but she could see with her own eyes that he was not. The evidence was stacked all around her in neat rows, labeled and organized and real. That evening, one of the guards approached the women's area carrying a wooden crate. He was a tall soldier with dark hair and an easy smile. Through gestures and simple words, he offered them bottles from the crate. The bottles were a strange shape, curved and green, with red labels. He opened one and handed it to Margarita. saying a word she did not know. Coca-Cola. She sniffed the bottle suspiciously. The liquid inside was dark brown and bubbled. The other women gathered around, watching to see if Margarita would try it. She took a small sip. The sweetness flooded her mouth, so intense it almost hurt. The bubbles fizzed on her tongue. It tasted like sugar and something else she could not name, something that seemed to capture everything foreign and excessive and impossible about America in a single bottle.
The soldiers smiled at her reaction and handed out more bottles to the other women. Some refused, still suspicious, but others tried it, and their faces showed the same shock that Marguerite felt. This was what American soldiers drank? Not as a special treat, not on holidays, but just as an ordinary beverage on an ordinary evening. The soldier finished his own bottle, tossed it in a bin, and walked away whistling. To him, it was nothing. To the German women, it was a crack spreading through the foundation of everything they had been told about the world. That night, after the lights were turned down and the soldiers in their cots had fallen asleep, the women whispered to each other in the darkness. Helga, the young one, said what they were all thinking. "If this is how their soldiers live," she whispered, "what do their regular people have at home? How rich must America be? How much food must they grow? How strong must their factories be? And if they have all this, why did we think we could ever win a war against them?" The whispers continued for hours, question after question, each one pulling another thread from the fabric of lies they had been wrapped in. Marguerite lay awake long after the others had fallen silent. She thought about the ice cream, and the white bread, and the soap that smelled like flowers. She thought about the guard who had slept 6 feet away from her and never once threatened her. She thought about the American doctor who had apologized for having cold hands, and she began to understand that everything, absolutely everything, had been inverted. Strength was not what she had been taught. Power was not what she had believed. And the monsters in this war had not been the ones the propaganda had named. The breaking point came on the 4th of July. Marguerite had been in American custody for nearly 4 months by then. The war in Europe had ended in May with Germany's complete surrender. The women were no longer prisoners of war in any active sense, but they could not yet go home because there was no functioning government to release them to, and no reliable way to transport them safely. So they remained in the camp, in a strange suspended state between captivity and freedom, watching their captors and learning things they could not unlearn. The Americans announced that the 4th of July was their Independence Day, their most important national holiday. They were going to have a celebration, and the German prisoners were invited to watch. Marguerite expected speeches about military victory, displays of weapons, perhaps a parade of armed soldiers to remind everyone who had won the war. That was how Germans celebrated national pride. That was how every nation, she knew, celebrated power. But the American celebration was something entirely different. The soldiers set up a flat field with white painted lines and 4 canvas bags at the corners. They divided into teams and began playing a game that made no sense to Margarita. One man threw a ball, another man hit it with a wooden stick, and then everyone ran in circles while the others yelled and cheered. It was called baseball, the interpreter explained. It was a game. They were playing a game on their national holiday. Not marching, not demonstrating weapons, not giving speeches about destiny and glory, just playing. Someone brought out a radio and music poured from it. American music with trumpets and drums and a rhythm that made people want to move. Some of the soldiers started dancing with each other, laughing and spinning. Others gathered around a metal grill where officers were cooking meat. The smell of roasting beef drifted across the camp, rich and thick. Margarita watched a black American soldier laughing with white soldiers, standing in the same group, eating from the same plates. The propaganda had said America was weak because the race is mixed. The propaganda had shown pictures of racial chaos and disorder. But these men worked together, fought together, celebrated together. She had been told this was impossible, that it was disgusting, that it proved American degeneracy. But watching them now, she saw something the propaganda had never prepared her for. She saw that it worked. They were not weak. They were strong because they were together, not in spite of it. The camp commander stood on a wooden platform and gave a short speech. The interpreter translated. He talked about freedom and independence. He said that America had been born from the idea that all people deserved to govern themselves, that no king or dictator should have power over free citizens. He said they had fought this war to stop tyranny, to protect that freedom not just for Americans, but for everyone. And then he said something that made Marguerite's breath catch. He said he looked forward to the day when Germans would be free too, when they could rebuild their country on principles of democracy and human dignity. He said this war was not against the German people, but against the evil system that had controlled them.
Then the commander did something no German officer would ever do. He invited the prisoners to come forward and take food. Not separate rations, not leftovers, but the same food the soldiers were eating. Hamburgers, he called them. Meat on soft bread with cheese and vegetables. He handed Marguerite a small American flag on a stick and said through the interpreter that he hoped someday Germans and Americans would be friends. She held the little flag and felt something crack open inside her chest. That night, the German women gathered in their sleeping area and talked in low, urgent voices. One woman, an older one who had worked in the Ministry of Propaganda itself, said quietly that perhaps they had been on the wrong side. Perhaps the things they had been told about who was good and who was evil had been reversed. Another woman began to cry and said she could not believe that everything she had worked for had been a lie. But Helga, the youngest one, said something that silenced them all. She said the American guards had been sleeping near them for 4 months now. 4 months. And not once, not one single time had any of them been touched or threatened or harmed. The propaganda said Americans were animals, but animals do not have the power to show mercy and choose to use it. Only humans do that. Only moral people do that.
Marguerite thought about the soldier who had given her the Coca-Cola, smiling like it was nothing. She thought about the doctor with the cold stethoscope who apologized. She thought about the commander talking about freedom for everyone, even his enemies. And she understood that what she had mistaken for weakness was actually a kind of strength she had never imagined. Germany had been taught that strength meant taking what you wanted, dominating the weak, showing no mercy. But America had food and factories and weapons far beyond what Germany ever possessed, and they used that power to give ice cream to prisoners. They could do anything they wanted, and what they chose to do was show kindness. The propaganda had inverted everything. It had called cruelty strength and kindness weakness. It had called theft pride and generosity. It had called domination greatness and equality chaos. But Marguerite could see now with perfect clarity that Nazi Germany had been weak precisely because it was cruel. A system that had to murder and steal and terrorize to survive was not strong. It was desperately, pathetically weak. America did not need to terrorize anyone. It had such abundance that it could afford to be generous. It had such confidence that it could afford to be kind. That was real power. That was real strength.
She found a scrap of paper and a pencil and wrote in tiny letters, hiding her words like a confession. They defeated us, not despite their kindness, but because of what made kindness possible. A nation that feeds its enemies is a nation that has conquered scarcity itself. A nation that sleeps peacefully beside those it has captured is a nation that has conquered fear. We called them weak for having abundance, weak for showing mercy, weak for believing all people deserve dignity. We were fools. We were defeated by our own lies. The moment she wrote those words,
Marguerite knew she could never go back to being the person she had been. That person was dead, killed by ice cream and white bread and soldiers who slept soundly because they had nothing to be ashamed of. The repatriation order came in November of 1945, 6 months after the war ended. Marguerite and the other women were given papers identifying them as processed prisoners, cleared to return to Germany. Each woman received a cardboard box stamped with American military markings. Inside were things that seemed both generous and cruel in what they revealed about the gap between nations. There were cans of soup and meat. There were chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper. There was a bar of that white soap that smelled like flowers.
There were cigarettes, valued as currency in the destroyed economy, waiting for them. There was a wool blanket. And tucked at the bottom was a small booklet in German about democracy and how governments could serve people instead of ruling them. The women were loaded onto trucks and then trains for the journey east into Germany. Margareta sat by a window and watched the landscape change as they crossed the border. France had been damaged by war, but it was recovering. Fields were being plowed, buildings were being repaired, people walked the streets with purpose. But Germany was different. Germany looked like the end of the world. Every city they passed through was a landscape of rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their walls collapsed, their windows empty. Mountains of brick and concrete lined the streets where crews worked slowly to clear paths. The train had to stop frequently because the tracks were damaged or blocked by debris. Margareta saw children picking through garbage heaps, looking for anything useful or edible. She saw old women pulling carts loaded with salvaged wood, their faces gray with exhaustion and hunger. She saw men with missing limbs, veterans of the lost war, begging at train stations. The contrast with what she had left behind in American custody was so violent it made her physically ill. She had spent 6 months eating white bread and butter. These people looked like they were starving. She had slept on a cot with a clean blanket. These people were living in basements and ruins.
The train reached Hamburg in the evening. Hamburg, where Margareta had grown up, where she had gone to school and played in parks and dreamed of becoming a nurse. Hamburg was gone. The city she remembered had been replaced by a waste of rubble that stretched as far as she could see. The firestorm bombing of 1943 had killed 40,000 people in a single night, and the ruins still stood exactly as they had fallen. No one had the resources to rebuild. People just lived in the spaces between the destruction. Margareta walked through streets she had known her entire life and could not recognize them. Every landmark was destroyed. The church where her family had attended services was a shell of blackened stone. The school where she had learned to read was a pile of bricks with weeds growing through it. The shop where her father had sold fabric and buttons had burned completely, leaving only a foundation and a twisted metal sign. She found her family in the basement of a building that had partially survived. Her mother and younger sister were living there with 7 other people, all of them refugees or survivors with nowhere else to go. The basement was damp and cold. It smelled of mold and unwashed bodies and sickness. A single candle provided light. There was no electricity. There was no running water. People slept on the floor wrapped in whatever fabric they had found. Her mother had aged 20 years in the 2 since Marguerite had last seen her. Her sister, who had been a healthy girl of 16 when the war ended, now looked thin and haunted, her eyes too large in her pale face. They embraced and cried, and then her mother asked the question that Marguerite had been dreading, "Where is your father?" Marguerite had to tell her that her father was dead, killed in the final weeks of fighting when old men and young boys were sent to defend positions that could not be defended. Her mother nodded slowly, as if she had already known, as if she had just been waiting for confirmation. She said that Marguerite's brother was also dead, frozen in Russia. Her cousin was dead, drowned when his submarine sank.
The boy Marguerite had once hoped to marry was dead, cause unknown. Out of the extended family of 23 people, only 9 remained alive.
Margareta opened the cardboard box the Americans had given her. She took out the chocolate bars and the cans of soup and the cigarettes. The other people in the basement gathered around, staring at the treasure like it was gold. She distributed it as fairly as she could, breaking the chocolate into small pieces so everyone could have some. The children who received the chocolate sat very still, letting it melt slowly on their tongues, their eyes closed. Some of them had never tasted chocolate in their lives. It had been gone from Germany that long. Her mother asked how the Americans had treated her. The others in the basement leaned closer to hear. Everyone had heard stories about what happened to prisoners. Everyone had believed the propaganda about American savagery. Margareta thought about that first night, lying terrified on her cot while soldiers slept 6 feet away and did nothing. She thought about the white bread and butter at breakfast. She thought about the doctor who apologized for cold hands. She thought about the ice cream and the Coca-Cola and the baseball game on Independence Day. She thought about the commander who said he hoped Germans and Americans would be friends. She looked at her mother's gaunt face and her sister's hollow eyes and the frightened children holding their precious pieces of chocolate. And she said quietly, "They treated us like human beings. They treated us the way we should have treated everyone." Her mother stared at her for a long moment, and then she began to cry. Not sad crying, but something deeper and more painful. The crying of someone who understands what has been lost and can never be recovered. The weeks and months that followed were hard in ways that fighting a war had never been hard. At least in war there was purpose and structure, and the belief that sacrifice meant something. In defeated Germany, there was only survival. Day by day, scraping by on rations that were never enough, and trying to rebuild with no materials and no money and no hope. Marguerite found work as a translator for the British occupation authorities because she had learned some English from the Americans. The pay was minimal, but it was steady, and it came with a ration card that provided a little extra food. She used some of her pay to buy paper and pencils, rare and expensive as they were. At night, by candlelight, she began to write down everything she remembered from her time in American custody. She wrote about the sleeping soldiers and the white bread and the ice cream. She wrote about the abundance that seemed impossible and the casual kindness that no one had prepared her for. She wrote about the black soldier laughing with white soldiers and how that image had destroyed everything she had been taught about racial purity. She wrote about the commander's speech on Independence Day and the little American flag she had been given and still kept hidden in her belongings. Years passed. Germany began to slowly heal. The currency was reformed. The Marshall Plan brought American aid that rebuilt factories and houses. Food appeared in the stores again. Children stopped looking hungry. Marguerite finished her education and became a teacher, working with young students in a rebuilt school. She never married. She never spoke publicly about her time as a prisoner. But she kept the small American flag folded in a drawer, and she kept the notebooks where she had written her memories. She taught her students about democracy and human rights and the importance of questioning authority. She taught them that strength was not the same as cruelty, and that kindness was not the same as weakness. She taught them to judge nations not by their propaganda, but by how they treated people who were completely in their power. When students asked her about the war, she told them the truth. Germany had been on the wrong side. The Nazis had been evil. The things done in Germany's name had been unforgivable. And the people who defeated that evil had been better than any propaganda could capture. In 1985, when Margaret was 64 years old and retired from teaching, a young historian interviewed her for a project about women's experiences in the war. The historian asked what she had learned from being a prisoner of the Americans.
Margaret was quiet for a long time, remembering that first impossible night when soldiers had slept beside her and done nothing, when her entire understanding of good and evil had begun to crack apart. Finally, she said, "I learned that the real measure of a civilization is not how powerful it is, or how pure it claims to be, or how great it says it will become. The measure is in the small, ordinary moments when power could be abused and is not. It is in the soldier who could take advantage but chooses to sleep peacefully instead. It is in the doctor who asks permission before touching a patient who is also an enemy. It is in the nation that has so much abundance it can give ice cream to people who tried to kill them. We called that weakness. We called generosity soft and mercy foolish and equality chaos. We were wrong about everything. We lost the war the moment we became the kind of people who thought cruelty was strength, and they wanted long before their soldiers landed because they were the kind of people who could afford to be kind."
The historian asked if she ever regretted anything. Marguerite looked out the window of her small apartment at the rebuilt streets of Hamburg, at the children playing in parks that had once been rubble, at the peaceful, prosperous city that had risen from ash. She said, "I regret believing the lies for as long as I did. I regret every day that I wore that uniform and served that system. But I do not regret being captured. Being captured saved my life, not because it kept me from dying in the war, but because it showed me what I had become and gave me a chance to be something different. That first night, when those soldiers went to sleep and left us untouched, that was the night my real education began. Everything I have taught, everything I have tried to be since then, started in that moment, when I realized that the monsters were not the ones I had been told to fear." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.